I am Louise Thompson and I'm currently the chairman of the Hutton Buscel Parish Council. I've lived in the village since 1985 and used to be a partner at the West Ayton Surgery until I retired in 2017. The Parish Council have been involved with restoring various parts of the village. This made us realise although lots of people know all sorts of things about the history of the village, little of this information has been recorded. A booklet was produced by Mr. Piers Percival, who used to live in the village, in 2007, and this documented the early history, but we were very keen to record the more recent social history as well. I approached Neil Gardner, who I know has a keen interest in local history and has had long family connections with the village. A flyer was sent to each house and publicity was given through the Hutton Buscel newsletter, asking for information and photos. Neil has been inundated with fascinating local stories and spent many hours collating them to make this film. I do hope you enjoy it. It would be impossible to name and thank everyone who has given their time and shared all their memories, but without them, this film could not have been made.
Hutton Buscel has an ancient history stretching back to the Norman conquest and indeed long before that. These Neolithic artefacts were found by Michael Wood and Piers Percival in his fascinating and seminal book An Early History of the Parish of Hutton Buscel and West Ayton, which he updated in 2011 to mark 900 years since the arrival in this part of northern England of Reginald Buscel, covers the prehistoric history in fascinating detail. This film, however, is focusing on much more recent times, from around the time of Queen Victoria's accession to the throne through to the present day. Where there are interesting records going back further, they'll be included where appropriate, but this is essentially a visual journey looking at the lives of the people and the characters who make and who've made this village what it is today. This is an article that appeared in the Newcastle Evening Chronicle on Tuesday the 4th of March 1902. It refers to a thunderstorm that took place in Hutton Buscel and the surrounding area on Sunday the 2nd of March at around 5:45 in the evening. Scarborough and district was on Sunday night visited by a severe thunderstorm, in the course of which the old parish church at Hutton Buscel near Forge Valley was struck by lightning and the tower reduced to a wreck. It was about 15 minutes before the time for the evening service to commence, when there was a blinding flash of lightning followed by a crash. About 30 people were in the church at the time, and they rushed out into the open air, leaving hats, books, umbrellas and overcoats behind them, under the impression that the tower was falling through the roof. The lightning tore a hole through the wall of the tower about 5 feet square, and tore the inner part of the wall away over an area of 15 feet. The shock was so great that the masonry has been loosened in almost every direction. The 3 bells in the belfry were left uninjured, though their support was rendered insecure, and they were almost embedded in debris. About half a ton of stonework from the tower fell into the belfry chamber just over 2 men who were tolling the bell. The porch door was shattered by the lightning, but 3 youths standing in the porch escaped uninjured. The leadwork on the roof has been stripped off in places, and one piece was hurled a distance of 100 yards or more. The damage is covered by insurance.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
Louis Worth came from a family which had started off life in Seymour, and he was the son of my grandfather's general factotum for the family, and he used to, for instance, take the piano which was used for the services in Ayton were carried by him in a pony cart every time he went to take a service at Ayton. Anyhow, Louis grew up with my father, who was the son of the vicar of Seymour. And when he grew up, he came, and I think he must have worked for the vicar of Hutton Buscel. But he didn't go to the Hutton Buscel church. I think he became more of a Methodist, because his memorial was in the Methodist church chapel. But Louis, a friend of my father, and of my mother died of wounds at the end of the war. And because he didn't come from Seymour, he wasn't put on Seymour's grave, because by that time his father had retired and now lived in Ayton. He had no rights to go down on a war memorial at Ayton. But my father, who had been very fond of him, felt that he should be recorded somewhere. And as he'd worked at Hutton Buscel in the vicarage, I don't know for certain, that he worked hard to make sure that Louis Worth's name was on the war memorial. And when I used to come up as a child, we used to visit his parents, who lived in the weavers' cottages at East Ayton.
This photograph was found in the garage of Harland Hill some 30 years ago, when the Rays moved in. Previously, the house had been owned by John and Elsie Brocklebank, who'd lived there for many years. John and Helen Ray knew nothing about the photograph or why it had been left behind, but because of the subject, they could never bring themselves to throw it out. And seeing the faces of those men in that photograph fascinated me. Who were they? And more importantly, what connection did they or one of their number have with Hutton Buscel? After a lot of research and invaluable help from the York Army Museum and the online Great War Forum, I finally managed to unravel the mystery. These were all officers of the 5th Battalion West Yorkshire Regiment, probably in around 1915. One signature on the front of the photograph, A.C. Watson, was repeated on the back, and so I guessed that this would probably be the link I was looking for. By researching on various genealogy websites, and after quite a few false starts, the pieces of the jigsaw started to come together. In 1907, Alfred Charles Watson, born in 1881, married Sarah Elizabeth Brocklebank at the Church of St. Maurice, York, which incidentally was demolished in 1969. By creating a Brocklebank family tree, I was able to establish that Alfred Charles Watson was John Brocklebank's uncle by marriage. And soon after this photograph was taken, the battalion was deployed to France. Very sadly, Captain Watson was killed in action on the 3rd of September 1916 in the Battle of the Somme. He was just 35.
We remember with thanksgiving and sorrow those whose lives in world wars and conflicts, past and present, have been given and taken away. Let us then remember before God those who've died for their country in war, those whom we knew, and those whose memory we hold dear.
Those from Hutton Buscel who gave their lives in the First World War: Captain Geoffrey Carew Barber, Lieutenant John Byron Barber, RN, Sergeant Louis Seaworth, Sergeant Frederick Nellis, Corporal John Barker, Private Stanley Goodwill, 2 Commonwealth War Memorial graves in the churchyard of Fred Bean and Sergeant J. Ray. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
By the latter part of the 17th century, Thomas Farside had become a major landowner at Hutton Buscel and was given the appointment of rector impropriate to the parish. This position meant that he was in charge of ecclesiastical property and that he could receive tithes of 1/10 of all the produce in the parish, out of which he would provide for the church plate, the vicar's living and maintenance of the church fabric. Apparently, though, Thomas Farside wasn't very popular with the villagers, as he exploited his position, taking extortionate tithes and also providing a very mean subsistence to the then vicar, the Reverend George Sheffield. More about this and what the villagers did about it can be read in Piers Percival's book. Towards the end of the 17th century, he built his mansion, Hutton Buscel Hall, an 8-shaped building in the neoclassical style. The east and west wings were separated by a wide stone passage. The carriageway to the front entrance lay to the south, the east wing faced meadows to the north of the church, and the stable block, a quadrangle that included the laundry, which still stands today. It's Kenneth and Helen Barnett's house, and number 87, where Henry and Dorothy Vasey once lived, lay to the northwest. So the main entrance to the hall would have been from the south, where the A170 now runs, and if it were still standing today, from Main Street, we would have seen the rear of the hall, as we see in this artist's impression painted by Judy Wilson. The gateposts now at the entrance to the village hall and play area would have been the rear gates for the hall and probably the start of the driveway up to the walled garden. Anyway, before his death in January 1714, Thomas Farside had ordered the building of a schoolhouse with homestead to be built of stone and slate on Pearson's Garth, where at the time existed a decayed cottage. This was on the site of what in 1854 became the village reading room and later 85 Main Street, where Leonard and Peggy Day lived for many years. In 1840, when the school was situated behind the houses in Middle Lane, the head was 58-year-old John Lotherington. He had 3 sons, James, who was born in 1820, Charles, born in 1822, and John Jr., born in 1835. John Sr. died in 1854, and at around that time Lord Down built a new schoolhouse and adjoining schoolroom, what is now Beryl Lowson's house, and the village hall from where the Derwent Valley preschool now operates. After his father's death, Charles became the head. In 1892, Charles Lotherington retired at the age of 72, and James Garnett took over as head. He was just 25. His sister became an assistant teacher. James Garnett married Sophia Gell in June 1895, when he moved away from the village to East Ham in London. In that year, John Middleton took over as head, and his wife, Margaret Emma, became an assistant teacher. There are some fascinating entries in the school daily diaries or logbooks, too many to quote here, although they can be viewed at the Record Office in Northallerton quite easily for those who are interested. There are numerous references to children being absent for long periods due to working in the fields, and contrary to what one might imagine, there was a great deal of kindness and thought towards the children and their well-being. The head often comments on how cold it was for both teachers and children, and how the school had provided dry clothes and footwear for children who often arrived wet and cold. The temperature of the school at 10 this morning was only 34 degrees, and in the afternoon 42 degrees. In case of severe weather, as now, schoolwork is placed at a great disadvantage, because in spite of the greatest efforts to keep the scholars warm enough to attend to their lessons, the faulty construction of the building will not allow of much success. January the 28th, 1910. The weather is so bad that only 19 children presented themselves. I thought under the circumstances it would be better to keep the children at school and have all the coats brought into the main room to dry. Registers not marked as on December 20th last. In the afternoon 33 were present, the storm having abated. Registers marked accordingly. I still, after a time of uncertainty caused by the probable change of caretakers, regret to record that the school fires are rarely lit before 8 a.m. The regulations say 7 a.m. And the consequence is that much time is often lost by both scholars and teachers in the abnormally cold room. February the 15th, 1901. There have been every day many of the children arriving at school with wet boots and stockings. These, in every case, were provided with dry stockings and shoes, kept at school for the purpose. Wet clothing was as far as practicable treated in the same way. Mrs. Middleton has been too unwell for duty for a few days. One entry on the 23rd of January 1901 is very poignant. The death of Her Most Gracious Majesty the Queen at 6:30 p.m. yesterday was generally known amongst the children in this village the same evening. By many signs they showed in school a right appreciation of the sad event, e.g. choosing a suitable hymn and reducing the play hour to almost absolute silence. Various extracurricular activities were also provided for the children, which they must have enjoyed. This entry in the log. The boys received their first gardening lesson outdoor this afternoon. The Reverend T.G. Little present. Mr. Howden, a practical gardener, has charge of the outdoor instruction. And then on November the 6th, outdoor gardening lesson this afternoon. Mrs. Middleton was unable to take, either yesterday or today, the domestic economy class. This minute book is of the meetings of the trustees of West Ayton and Hutton Buscel schools. The opening minute refers to the rather prosaic matter of sanitation. The matter of the school sanitary accommodation was brought up, and it was decided that water closets should be installed in place of dry ash buckets, 2 in the girls' departments and 1 in the boys', and that the urinal in the boys' sector should be fitted with flushing apparatus. It was also decided to install new WCs in the schoolhouse, 1 upstairs in the bathroom and 1 immediately below it in the scullery. John Middleton died in 1924, and then Gertrude Lightfoot, born in 1889, became headmistress.
It starts with our eyes well acquainted with the dark. The mind was made to illuminate the heart.
Then I started school in about 38, I think, 9, and hated every minute of it. And then evacuees came year after, about 1939-40. The village was full of them at start. There was 1 or 2 stopped a bit after, but there was only Bill Thompson stopped right through. He worked on farms all over, and he ended up, he was a tipman.
What were the children like?
Well, most of them were all right. There was a few of them that had their hair clipped right off. I found out that was because they had a few lice.
As evacuees came, there was nothing in the village really to attract them whatsoever, because there was no cinema and there was no fish and chip shop There were no pub, and the Hull mothers did not appreciate it at all. So most of them stayed a very, very short time. The first evacuation in 1939, shortly after the war began, when they were quickly moved up here, they didn't last more than 2 or 3 weeks, I don't think. A lot of them went straight back. But there was a re-evacuation when the bombing started, and then we had children who did come, and one or two of them stayed and grew up here. Some of them married, and you probably can find that there are some people now who are related to people who actually were evacuated. I know we had in this house, there was a girl who stayed here and was brought up here, but she went back to her home, but she always came back to see us.
And what were your teachers like?
Horrible. Well, evacuee teacher, she wasn't so bad, but one that was there for years, Miss Lightfoot, if you made a blot, you had to report it to her, and I must not make blots 50 times, and if you didn't tell her, you went out and got stick.
Yes, she was very, very strict. I got the cane quite a bit, I don't know. I didn't think I was naughty, but I must have been. She used to keep it under the piano lid. And you knew when she went and got the lid up, you know, that you were in for it. And she used to live next door, and you didn't have to talk when she went. She often used to pop round to her house, probably cooking a dinner, you know, something. And the gate used to squeak when she came back. And she heard me say one day, "She's coming." And she knew who it was. I didn't get the cane for it, but in trouble. And but if you were poorly, she always came to the house. I remember having whooping cough and tonsillitis from her at the shop and other things. She always called to see how you were doing, you know. But she was a very, very strict teacher. Oh dear.
Miss Lightfoot remained in post as head until the 31st of August 1951, continuing as acting head until Mrs. Donaldson took up her duties in January 1952.
Try to look intelligent in case the teacher looked at me. She was long and she was lean. She's a middle-aged dream, and that lady means the whole world to me. It's a natural achievement, conquering my homework with her image pounding in my brain. She's an inspiration for my graduation, and she helps to keep the classroom sane. Oh teacher, I need you like a little child. You got something in you to drive the schoolboy wild. You gave me education in the love-sick blues. Help me get straight, come out, say teacher, I.
In 1956, Mrs. Donaldson left and Mrs. Skilbeck became head. In that same year, Miss Lightfoot died, and sadly, just 3 years later, in July 1959, Hutton Buscel School closed its doors for the last time. In 1968, Lady Downs set up a small preschool which operated just 1 day a week. Since its early days, the school has grown steadily into the committee-run preschool it is today, and many well-known names over the years have taught there and been in charge. Jean Stockill, Jean Carruthers, Jane Peacock, Janet Bell, Shirley Parker, Lynn Kemino, And of course, Derwent Valley Preschool, the name by which it's known today, continues to thrive under the leadership of Sally Marshall as head.
Remember the days of the old schoolyard? We used to laugh a lot. Oh, don't you remember the days of the old schoolyard? When we had imaginings and we had all kinds of things, and we laughed and needed love, yes I do. Oh, and I remember you. Remember the days of the old schoolyard? We used to cry a lot. Oh, don't you remember the days of the old schoolyard? When we had simplicity and we had warm toast for tea, and we laughed and needed love, yes I do. Oh, and I remember you. When we had imaginings and we had all kinds of things, and we laughed and needed love, yes I do. Oh, when I remember you.
It all started with an old lady called Mrs. Gordon that lived at the kennels down Middle Lane. I used to go and see her, and one day I was there and she asked me to go up the stairs to get her something, and lo and behold, on the window ledge was this empty bottle of gin, and they called it Squire's Gin, and I happened to notice the label around the neck was, well, apparently it was Hutton Buscel Hall. Anyway, I got a friend to do a painting of this picture, and then a friend called Michael Wood, he was going to Ravenscar, and I think there was a little pub there he went to, and lo and behold, on the wall was a picture of Hutton Buscel Hall, and he took this picture, and also there was a little tiny one of the squire that lived in the hall, and they had a party one day. It was one of the birthdays, and I think they got a little bit drunk or something, and a fire started in the kitchen, and of course the fire engine belonged to Wycombe, and Wycombe and Hutton Buscel weren't very friendly and wouldn't let them have the fire engine, so they had to get one from Scarborough, drawn by horses, to get here to put the fire out of the hall. Well, by the time they got here, of course, the hall was just about to rubble, and the house that is now here was built, as far as I know, from the stone of the hall, and it was a school and the schoolmaster's house. We moved here 43 years ago. I was born in Hull 28th of February 1927, so that must be 92 and a half. I worked all my life in Hull in an insurance office near Wilberforce House in the old part of Hull, all my working life. And I met my husband, and he was in the Air Force. He was a pilot in the Air Force. He was in the Battle of Britain, and he was mentioned in dispatches. And we got married 3rd of July, 48. We moved to Hutton Buscel, and he was here. He died 33 years ago, and I've lived here ever since on my own, as I say, with my 3 cats. And I've always taken an interest in the village because I want it to stay as a village, and I support everything that I can.
My name's Charles Schofield. I've lived in the village at the Forge for almost 30 years with my wife Shirley and my son James, who recently has started his own family. My mother and father came over in 1993 from the Dales to a bungalow at number 1 The Strange Ways, and had several very happy years here until they passed. And my dad, John Schofield, wrote a very beautiful poem whilst he was in Japanese captivity, and I'd like to read that for you. Basically, in 1942, when Singapore fell, the Japanese took him prisoner and put him into Changi jail, quite an infamous place. And he was then moved on to Kuching in Sarawak, the northern part of Borneo, where he wrote this poem in Kuching jail. Altogether, he had 3.5 years in captivity. And the poem is entitled When, by Captain John Schofield. When cruel wire and bayonet and heathen yellow guard no more confine our bodies to this cage, when men and nations everywhere receive their just award for this war's tragic blot on history's page, when husbands to their wives return and homes are in rejoicing, when mothers' anxious cares are kissed away, when children into fathers' ears young escapades are voicing, when lovers woo again and smiles the day, when broken bodies, aye, and hearts refuse to take defeat, but carry on in spite of knowing pain, when every class and creed resolve they'll never more repeat this bloody era war to bring them gain, when shattered towns from rubble heaps new countenances raise, when ships may sail the sea and escort spurn, when countryside grows plenteous crop and well-fed cattle graze, and laughter lightens task at plough and churn, when we decide once and for all that peace is worth the winning and that the game goes only to the strong, and secure in strength uphold the right at sign of tyrant sinning, thus keeping him and us from travail long, when conqueror and vanquished foe together chart a course that has a world united as its aim, when heart of man for guidance turns to life's immortal source, and inspiration wins from whence he came, then shall this world of blood and tears a brave new era know, of peace conceived, by selfless toil sustained. And men shall strive for common good and set the earth aglow with wisdom's light as by the book ordained.
Just imagine a cold, dismal afternoon in January 1945 with the snow on the ground and me as a young lad knowing all the aircraft that flew over and looking up towards the trees and came booming over a big 4-engined bomber. And what was it? It was a Liberator. That was the first Liberator that I'd ever seen close up. It was so close up you could see the guns bristling out of the side, the rear and the front of the plane. And as it just slowly boomed away across, it disappeared into the mist in a northerly direction. Later in the afternoon, the plane was reported travelling in a southerly direction, and as the pilot, I can imagine the pilot seeing a flat piece of land in front, but it was covered in snow, so there'd be no hedges, no roads, no nothing. But as approaching this flat piece of land, the plane had to lift suddenly because it approached Ancat Farm, and so lifted over the flat piece of land and headed southwards, and it hit the tree on the left and it clipped it. It was about that size at the time, and it clipped it down to about 10 feet tall, and it must have hit with an almighty bang, but it continued on its travels. The tree that the plane hit as it travelled southwards was this one, and to this very day you can see the stump that the plane hit, which was and imagine the tree was that size, and as you imagine a big bomber hitting a tree like that, it must have done a bit of damage to it, but it got past this tree, and as you can see it travelled southwards down that field, and approximately it wouldn't be very high, it was virtually skimming the ground as it went down. That's the tree in the far distance that the plane clipped on the top, and as it came down unfortunately it got down the road, and as it came down the road at great speed, it came down through, and just along the side here was a great big tree which it hit full impact just to the left hand side of the fuselage. The left hand wing was catapulted far enough down that field, and the rest of the plane ended up in one big heap just here, and it literally was a big heap. Had that plane been 50 yards to the left on this side, it would have had a clear field to have landed in, and would have landed perfectly safely, but unfortunately it hit the only tree that was in the area. Still thinking about the plane as it was going across that hill, across those trees. We're having tea later in the afternoon, and as you know, you sit quietly talking about things, and of course nobody's interested in the plane I'd just seen. There was a knock on the door, and it was George Craggs. George used to live up at Ancat then, and he said to my father very quietly, would he please come, because there'd been a plane crash up the lane. Of course my father then was the special constable at Hutton Buscel, as it was wartime, and straight away went off, and later in the evening came back with well, I'd gone to bed by then, but later told me all about the plane crashing and how he'd met, I don't know, it was one or two of the survivors. One of the survivors says there was only one or two, and it's the actual fact. And they asked, which country are we in? He said, we're in Yorkshire, in England. Well, they'd heard of England, they knew England, but they'd never heard of Yorkshire. They didn't know where that was. And so I remember afterwards that my father was quite upset by what he had seen in recovering the bodies the night before. The army camp in the early part of the war was in this field here. The first thing you saw was this big tree, which was a big tree then. It's actually fallen down and the new one grown. And about halfway up was a little platform where the sentry box was. And as you walked up, there was someone sat in that little box up there, which is a terrible cold job. When it got towards winter, was sat in that little box. And as you look down towards the field, originally there was just one big hut right in the middle of the field, and on the other side was a row of searchlights which were watching out for the planes coming, the German invasion from the east coast obviously, and which much to the annoyance in the people of Ayton, and I think the soldiers did this on purpose. They used to dip the headlights down over Ayton and light Ayton up, but they used to laugh about it. And I think it was right at the very beginning of the war. It was a bit of a joke, was things like that, and they did play tricks with the soldiers. And down this side of the field, they ended up with a long row of huts. Up the road, there was a big concrete pillbox on the left-hand side of the road. In the middle of the field, they had two anti-aircraft guns. I never heard anything much about them being used, but the power for the searchlights came up the field, and they were hidden away in the farmyard with two big generators, which used to buzz and buzz on a night when the searchlights started. And but they had two huts down in the farmyard. Towards the latter end of the war, it all ended up in a little bit of a mystery, as far as I was concerned, because there were hundreds of soldiers here towards one point. I think they were just building up. That overnight they all went, and they cleared everything away. And the rumour was that they never got to war, didn't the soldiers? They were torpedoed on their way. There was only one or two ever came back with any information about what happened. As boys, we used to come up after the crash and wander around and play with all the equipment. One day even there was two men with a van with a pump, pumping petrol out of the wing that had flown down, that had catapulted down the field. I don't know whether they ever got any or not, but we used to come and play about with the ammunition and all the things. I know one boy went off with a a very pistol, fully loaded. I don't know what happened to that. And that happened for, at least a couple of weeks, I would think. I can't remember now, we came up several times. And there was never anybody on guard, no security, no nothing. Until one day, the Americans arrived. It'd been an American plane. And they came with a company of, I don't know whether it was a company, what do you call it in military terms, but quite a few men. And they wanted accommodation in the village. I know that they came and asked my mother if she would accommodate, and she agreed readily. But when they came, the security was tight. No one was allowed near, and they meticulously cleaned every bit. And you could go several weeks later and you could not find a little bit of metal, glass, or anything. The field was bare. They'd cleared everything.
In Old Tawny Common there's a pub and a cow, and there lives a mole catcher, and I'll tell you how. Well, he goes a mole catching from morn until night, while the jolly young farmer goes playing with his wife, singing ho, 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 all day and all night, singing ho, 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 till the moon it shone bright. Well, the mole catcher, jealous of the very same thing, so he hid in the alehouse and watched him come in. When that young farmer jumped over the stile, well, it caused the mole catcher to laugh and to smile, singing ho, 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 all day and all night, singing ho, 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 till the moon it shone bright. He knocked at the door, and this he did say, oh, where is your husband, good woman, I pray? Well, he's gone a mole catching, so you need not fear. But little did she think a mole catcher was near, singing ho, 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 all day and all night, singing ho, 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 till the moon it shone bright. She went upstairs and he followed the sign, but the mole catcher followed them closely behind. And when they got into the middle of their sport, well, the mole catcher grabbed him quite fast by his coat, singing ho, 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 all day and all night, singing ho, 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 till the moon it shone bright. He clapped his hands and he laughed at the sight, saying here's the best mole that I've caught in my life, and I'll make you pay well for ploughing my ground, and the money it shall be no less than £10, singing ho, 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 all day and all night, singing ho, 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 till the moon it shone bright. Very well, said the farmer, the money I don't mind, for it only works out about twopence a time. So come all you young farmers and mind where you're at, don't you ever get caught in a mole catcher's trap, singing ho, 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 all day and all night, singing ho, 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 till the moon it shone bright, singing ho, 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 all day and all night, singing ho, 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 till the moon
The Jeffelses had lived in Hutton Buscel for a number of years at Southview Farm in the Dale. I believe that was Ward Jeffels. But my namesake, David Jeffels, was well known for very many years as an exhibitor of agricultural horses, and went all over North Yorkshire, winning prizes with his decorated horses. He farmed at Ruston for many years with other members of the family. When we moved to Hutton Buscel, after a few years, I was intrigued by a board that was on the front of the house, and one day I climbed up a ladder and pulled this board off, and I discovered that it had on it the name Hutton and then a bushel measure underneath it, and I believe the date below it was 1842 or 1843. And it had been covered up in the war to shield the village's identity from the Germans. And there are in fact 3 houses in the village that still have these signs. One is what was West End Farm, the other was number 90 Hutton Buscel, and then the third was down in the Dales, where a lady called Mrs. Fletcher lived. So far as the public house is concerned, the Langley family, which preceded the Dorneys, had the pub named after their family, and there are still some houses in the village which have the initials of MDL, Marmaduke Langley, on in the houses and on the outside of the houses as well. Langley House pub eventually became known as Scoresby House. I'm not sure what the connection was with Hutton Buscel and Scoresby, but of course Scoresby was a very big sea explorer, and he was the inventor of the crow's nest in ships, and he sailed out of Whitby at the time of James Cook. Eventually, the pub switched from one side of the road to the other, to the old road, to what is now the old roadhouse, and it was there that Herbert Dennis became the landlord, and eventually he moved to the Down Arms at Wycombe after the Hutton Buscel pub closed, and his daughter Mary married Sir Leonard Hutton, the England and Yorkshire cricketer, and they were in fact married at Wycombe Church, and retained their interest in the village up to Sir Leonard's death.
We got a white pony, my father got 30 shillings for, and when I was about 3.5, I rode a willow green across moor to see my great-grandmother, and then I rode up on my own, but I turned frightened to go down into Misery. It was a bit steep.
But you lived at Charm Park
all my life.
All your life. And this was mixed farming or
yeah.
Yes, mixed farming.
We had alt farm, and then they took it in, and I was just left with 60 acre.
Yes.
There's only working farms at Dale End left.
Singing yan tan tethera, medera pip pazera, sezera cara contradic.
There was Bill Dallas on here, had milking cows, and he sold flour and stuff. Then Dickinson's, they sold few bits, and then the shop, it isn't a shop now, but was shop, you know, past what was post office and t'others, was a shop there. 4 or 5 selling milk. Melbourne and Crosby over road here, up that little lane.
Cowgate.
Somebody had some milk cows there, and then there was Barker's had a house and a greenhouse, had a cow, and then top of hill was Sheffield, had farm, one of them 2 houses together.
Yes, I know.
And to the side of the road, its houses built down its farmyard.
Yes.
And then they had what they called polyard, big walls and a bit of house in there.
Right.
And then John Parker bottom of the hill had a couple of cows and sold milk.
In 1834, 3 years before Queen Victoria acceded to the throne, Mary Trousdale of Hutton Buscel gave birth to a baby boy in this small cottage at the bottom of Dale Hill. She named him Crosby, the maiden name of her mother-in-law. There is nothing particularly significant about the birth of this baby. In fact, he was born in very humble circumstances. However, he grew up to be one of the characters of the village, and I suspect that he and his family enjoyed quite a level of notoriety in the village, and even further afield. Some of the details of Crosby's birth are a bit sketchy and vague, but as far as I can ascertain, his father was Richard Trousdale, who was born on the 23rd of October 1796 in Thornton Dale, and his mother was Mary Hackings, born also in Thornton Dale in 1790. I haven't been able to fully corroborate all the evidence, but I guess that something happened to Richard Trousdale, or more likely to the relationship with Mary. We know that Richard died in 1851 in Whitby at the age of 54. However, in the census of 1841, 10 years before Richard's death, Mary is already living in Hutton Buscel with Crosby, who was 7 at the time, in her father-in-law John Trousdale's house, the little cottage at the bottom of Dale Hill. Also lodging in the house was another family, the Bendons, John, Francis and their son George, but I know nothing about them or why they came to be lodging with the Trousdales. Anyway, Crosby's grandfather, John Trousdale, was quite a character, it seems. He was born in 1768 in Kirby Moorside, and he married Elizabeth Crosby. There's a record in the archives at Northallerton relating to an incident in December 1800. John Trousdale was convicted on the 15th of December of that year of being idle and disorderly person, and he was committed to the House of Correction at Northallerton. There's an order to the High Constable of Pickering Lythe East Division to pay George Skelton, Constable of Hutton Buscel, his expenses for conveying John Trousdale to Northallerton. I'm afraid I haven't delved deeper into the archives to find out how long he was there or any more about the incident. The fact is, though, it seems that the cottage at the bottom of Dale was in a pretty appalling condition, certainly from that time, 1800, until it was finally demolished or until it fell down in the early 1900s, after the occupants had all died. Crosby married Nancy Harrison, a girl from Hutton Buscel, in 1858, when Crosby was 25 and Nancy was 26. Nancy had already given birth to Hannah. It seems likely that she was Crosby's child, although nothing is certain. 5 years earlier, in 1853, but after they married, the couple went on to have 2 more daughters and 2 sons. In the 1861 census, when Crosby was 27 and Nancy was 26, all 3 daughters had been born, Hannah in 1853, Emma in 1858 and Fanny in 1860. Crosby at that time was an agricultural labourer. The pair went on to have their sons Francis in 1866 and James in 1869. Francis married and in 1911 was a carter living at 6 Gladstone Lane in Scarborough with his wife Rose and son Fred. Emma married William Jennings on the 1st of January 1881 in Scarborough. Here we see them together in their late 70s or early 80s, having had 12 children in 20 years. William died in 1940, aged 87, and Emma died a year later, aged 83. Nancy, Crosby's first wife, died in 1884, aged 52. Then, on the 14th of October 1888, he married a woman from Wheatcroft in Scarborough, one Sarah Story. By this time, he was 54 and she was only 45, and she had 4 children of her own. I suspect they were all illegitimate. At some point at a later date, probably after all the children had left home, Sarah's elder brother, John Story, moved into the tumble-down cottage in the Dale. I don't think he added to the decor, although I have to admit there's something rather appealing about the two men, and I think they were probably regarded as a bit of a novelty. According to some social history research done several years ago, the cottage in the Dale was known as Cross's Castle, and others have referred to it as Crosby Mansion. I suspect it was Crossy's Castle rather than Cross's, but anyway, the cottage stood just to the east of what is now Roy Parker's house, South View. Sarah's Story was known as Sally, and she, Crosby, and her brother John, who had the nickname of Johnny on his heels because of his peculiar way of walking, all lived in pretty ghastly conditions. The front door of the cottage was never locked, if it even had a lock, and when the family had retired to bed, it is said that often the village boys would open the door and listen to the conversation inside. I'm sure they found other ways to amuse themselves as well at the old couple's expense. In the summer, Crosby and Johnny used to stock up their handcarts with sweets and push them to Forge Valley, where they sold their wares from a wall top. They probably didn't tell their young customers, however, that the good clean sweets were stored under their beds. This photograph shows Crosby on the left with Johnny on the right, as they plied their trade in Forge Valley. The two smart ladies seemed to be very happy to pose for the camera. Perhaps they were buying chocolate. This is pure surmise, but the little girl standing behind may be Ida Ryby, Crosby's granddaughter, who lived in Wycombe. On the other hand, she could be just a local young customer from the houses nearby. The vicar of Hutton Buscel at that time was the Reverend Thomas Gurney Little, and he used to pass his old clothes on to Crosby and Johnny. But as the vicar was over 6 feet tall and Crosby and Johnny were quite small men, I'm sure they would have looked pretty amusing in their second-hand topcoats, as I'm sure they would never have altered any of the clothing given to them. At home, the Trousdales cured rabbit skins and hung them inside the house. The smell would have been fairly unbearable, I'm sure. The upper story of the cottage eventually became uninhabitable, and the whole building finally collapsed or was demolished sometime after the First World War, after Sarah, Crosby and Johnny had all died.
Where the silage bales were, there was 2 houses there. There's one house at the other side of this building here, the left hand, which was facing east and west. On the side there where the building is, covered in ivy, was another house, and there was another house a bit further in where the tree is. There were the Mrs. Lapish lived there. I can remember that there were two Mrs. lived. And if you go up to the churchyard and you walk out at the front of the church and you see a single granite stone, a horizontal stone in front of the church, it is the Lapish family are buried there. There must have been a family of some substance, because it's the only granite gravestone in the churchyard of that age.
I grew up in Hutton Buscel, moved here with my parents, who my mother was in the Land Army, and met my father at Wycombe Abbey. And they moved to Hutton Buscel in about 1944-45, and then I arrived on the scene. I was a member of the reading room, along with several of my mates in the village, and over the years the numbers declined to such an extent that we had to look at ways of keeping it going, and we decided, the younger members of the village, of the reading room, decided it would be a good idea to have extend its membership to some of the girls in the village, because there was no facility at all for them. But unfortunately, when it went before the reading room committee, the idea was turned down. And I think that was my first encounter with the media, because the local paper picked it up, and it went to the Northern Echo and the Yorkshire Post, that were almost having this revolution that men had always occupied the reading room for reading and playing snooker and darts and dominoes and so on, and the men wanted to keep it that way. However, we decided we weren't going to be beaten altogether, and as a result of that, we set up a youth club in the village with the help of the local Bobby, Ernie Killick, and it ran for several years, and I think it was probably responsible for quite a few romances. The property that we all know now as the Holt, the residential home for the elderly, that was for many years the vicarage. But when it ceased to be the vicarage, it became the headquarters of what was then known as the British Junior Naturalists Association. And it was a very successful educational centre for youngsters, headed by a chap called Geoffrey Watson, a lovely man, who had run the Wood End Museum at Scarborough and then became a director of museums in Teesside. And it was a very successful and highly regarded operation, because it brought youngsters into the village and showed them rural life. Each Christmas morning, we went shouting, and shouting involved going round a number of houses, as many houses as we possibly could, wishing people a Merry Christmas, and getting a few pence for doing so, which was always appreciated, I think, not least because it made us a bit of pocket money.
Well, I'm Joyce Robinson. I live in Hutton Buscel, and I've lived in the village for the past 12 years. I was born in Brompton. But in this village, my grandparents, Sam and Maud Dawson, lived here. My dad, John Dawson, John William, or Jack as he was always known, was born in Baynig. My sister and brother-in-law both lived in the village, Jean and Roy Stockhill. I remember years ago coming from Ruston, where I lived, and walking over, which is now the caravan site, walking over the fields to come up to my granddad and grandma's house for our Sunday tea. Also in the village lived one of my aunts, Frances Baker, who lived where Mr. and Mrs. Gibson live now. She was their housekeeper. We used to have a post office in the village, but all that's gone. It was a post office and a little shop. That was nice. Years ago, when my sister Jean and Roy lived in the village, they lived in the schoolhouse. They were the caretakers of the schoolhouse. Then they moved out of there into a house further down the village. They had their 4 children there. There was Stephen, Susan, Karen and Simon, who I see quite a lot of. After I got married, which I was married for nearly 50 years, and during that time I had 3 children, Wendy, Sally and Michael, who all went to Wycombe School and then to various schools after that. I now have, very lucky, I have 6 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren, so I consider myself to be extremely lucky. When I was quite young, I can remember a plane coming down somewhere. I think it was one of the lanes in Hutton Buscel. I don't remember it coming down, but I do remember going up to see it. It was probably a bit macabre, really, I suppose. And I remember as well when my granddad and grandma were alive and I was young, we were able, because there were hardly any cars about, we were able to play cricket in the street, which was lovely. And then a few years ago we had it was when it was the Queen and Prince Philip's, when it was the Jubilee, yeah. And we had fancy dress through the village. I've got some photographs of that, it really brought everybody together. All the houses were decorated. It really did look lovely. And we also have the open gardens every year, which that brings people together. We have the village fete as well. On the open gardens, I'm the tombola lady, which I enjoy very much. It's a bit hard putting all the labels on everything, but it brings, as I said, it brings all the village together.
I work at Scarborough Hospital. Been there for 15 years, I think. Yes, it will. Yeah, no, it's 17. Mm. I've just retired and gone back again, fool that I am. I've got 3 children, 3 stepchildren and 11 grandchildren altogether. That's it, I think. I'm pretty boring.
No, you're not. I'm Karen, and I'm Jean and Roy Stockhill's youngest daughter. I'm married to Martin. We've got 2 children, Gemma and Jack, and we've also got 2 grandchildren, Jenny and Charlie. And I work at the base at East Ayton School. I remember when it was bonfire night, and we used to borrow the big cart. It was a big cart, trolley thing.
From
What's
Jackson's.
That? From Jackson's, Whitwin Jackson. Yeah. We used to do it every year.
Go around collecting rubbish.
Knock on everybody's doors. Have you got any rubbish for our bonfire, please? And everybody did. And we used to have the bonfire at schoolhouse.
Quite often they would save it for us, wouldn't they?
Would. Yeah,
because they knew we would be round with the cart.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And Mischief Night was quite a big thing.
Yeah, it was.
Because I can remember someone took our gate off and my father was hopping mad.
It was probably us.
But, things like eggs on the windows and...
we never did anything like that.
No, we used to tie people's door handles together and then knock on both doors and couldn't open the doors.
and we were rather naughty because feel awful now, because there was one lady that we picked on, Mrs. Ireland. We used to really like knocking on her door and running away because she would always react.
Yeah, she did. She used to come out with a frying pan, didn't she? I'll get you. I'll get you.
go to the post office was really great fun, because first of all, when you went along to the village, I couldn't possibly post a letter, and anybody who was not very tall could, because you had a little step to stand on in order to reach the postbox empty. Inside, it was dark, but you turned left. On the left-hand side, there was a room which was set up as a post office, but it had obviously been the sitting room, because it had all these stuffed birds all the way around it. And if I went to Mrs. Jennings, you always got a sweetie. So she was quite a popular lady, and she ran the post office, and was well known in the village. And like that, it stayed there until she died, and then eventually, they changed the post office and moved it to the new shop, which now is Lucy's house, and that was built after the war. But Mrs. Jennings was very famous, and I'm sure it was a lemon drop that the sweet was giving me. Now, sweeties, the other great thing, I can't remember them myself particularly, but I do know Francis used to tell me about the two gentlemen who sold sweeties in the village and lived in the cottage at the bottom of the hill and kept the sweeties under the bed. So we were forbidden to buy sweeties from them.
This was Crosby Trousdale and his brother-in-law Johnny.
Yes, that's right, yes. Yeah, the other thing I can remember, of course, in those days, you had Stop Me and Buy One, which was the ice cream man who came round every day in the evening at a convenient time when the children were just coming out of school, and could buy a penny cornet. Very popular, very nice. Past the post office, the first one on the right.
Cowgate?
What?
Cowgate?
Dowgate, yes. Well, the farm there was kept by a family called Barker, and Lucy Barker she was older than me, and I looked up to her a great deal because she worked and milked the cows, and we were taken to watch them and milk the cows. But Lucy, something had happened while she was milking the cows, and how it happened had got both of her fingers had been cut in half. So she had her hands were not normal. And she afterwards became a teacher. But they lived up at the farm, and they delivered the milk, or we went to collect the milk, which of course was much more fun, because you carried your small milk churn with you and collected the milk and brought it home again on the bicycle.